Not only the country of Japan, but at this point, the entirety of the My Hero Academia world is in a very precarious situation. The threat posed by the evil currently festering and bordering 100% completion is far too great to ignore. It has come to the point where even the United States government would go as far as to openly launch new and highly destructive weapons against the threat on foreign soil. And that is in addition to the unregulated confrontation of their #1 hero abroad. For as courageous as Star and Stripe's actions may be, with the incredible potential to resolve this entire issue with her own hands, she simultaneously stands to endanger even more lives by presenting the possibility of her quirk being stolen, which for me at least serves to make such transgressions more so foolish than heroic. Albeit from a strictly rational mindset, one might argue that heroism requires a degree of foolishness to begin with. Either way, regardless of how the fight turns out, it is virtually undeniable that the villain will emerge in some capacity. And at that, even if Star's godly quirk is not successfully obtained, the power of this evil entity is still largely unapproachable by the overwhelming majority of characters and forces. And mind you, this is all without him being at 100% completion. Star and Stripe is intended to be this awe-inspiring physical force, a rehash of the All Might approach that pretty much mirrors how All Might once believed himself to have killed All for One. But as we know, that way of doing things is dated and flawed. And certainly from a narrative perspective, we also know that Deku is the main character, and surpassing All Might is very different from becoming another All Might. And so his purpose is different and also supersedes the necessity of hers. And truly, based on the progression of Deku with One for All, on one hand it is remarkable how much he has been able to progress with it over the course of a year, but in comparison to his adversary, he is at a snail's pace. During the war, without the assistance of everyone else, Deku would have never been able to push Shigaraki as far as he did. And although he has gained access to all but one of One for All's quirks and progressed wonderfully in his time out and about after the war, he is simply not on Star's physical level, and certainly far from our resulting villains. Shigaraki with the power of All for One was dangerous enough by its lonesome. Now Deku is proposed to face off against a singular consciousness with the cunning and intelligence of All for One. And so what is the way forward here? How will Deku and the heroes manage to emerge from all of this victorious? Well, even despite all this, Deku is in fact the key, and it will also be thanks to the power of One for All. However, I do not believe Deku is going to overpower his opponent outright. And don't get me wrong, I have no doubt that the two will clash and fight, but although many do not like the prospect, Deku will in fact do as a true hero does and save someone in need. Now, the general reason this sort of resolution is so openly opposed by so many fans is because Shigaraki is an unredeemable character, plain and simple. Shigaraki is responsible for the deaths of thousands, and the threat now is one that stands to threaten millions. He has not even a hint of remorse about him and possesses absolutely no concern for human life. This is an entirely deplorable person, and so I completely understand that sentiment. However, at the end of the day, the story of My Hero Academia is a shonen battle series with many of the common tropes and cliches the genre is known for, forgiveness being one of them. And this isn't exactly something new and completely unexpected. Despite Bakugo being unrelenting in his bullying in the past, Deku, even if naively, still cherished and valued Bakugo, and these days doesn't hold any reservations against him. I mean, he pities his own bully. And despite the mentally and physically abusive environment fostered by his father's obsession with surpassing All Might, Shoto has been able to forgive Endeavor and is even willing to work with him in atoning for his sins. And now, especially because the prospect of saving has been proposed by Deku in this way, expecting such a thing not to happen at all would pretty much just be a state of denial. But with that being said, I do not believe this act of saving will be as most fans expect it. And that's because if 100% completion is actually achieved, saving Shigaraki will be virtually impossible. Why? Because there will be no Shigaraki to save. Even at this point, to reach out to Shigaraki would be a hopeless attempt, as he doesn't even know who he is. Not entirely, at least. What Deku is set to fight is an entirely new entity, a fusion between Shigaraki Tomura and All For One. The intended purpose of One For All, at least initially, was to destroy the evil that is All For One. But as we established previously, it likely will not be able to. When Deku faced he can join Shigaraki and All For One abomination within the vestige power, what he saw was someone who needed saving. Meanwhile, everyone else within One For All saw nothing of the sort. And so at this point, given all that we know about One For All and All For One, including the vestige world, it is my belief that the one to be saved by Deku will not be Shigaraki Tomura, but rather Shimura Tenko. When Deku said he wanted to save that little boy, this was not figurative, this was literal. You see, the vestige world is very, very strange. All the past wielders of One For All, with the exception of All Might, are dead. But at the same time, they are not actually within the quirk in the same way that All For One, the villain, is not actually within Shigaraki. A vestige is merely the will of an entity personified. And to be expressly clear, this is not the afterlife either. The vestige of All Might is not partially formed because he is still alive. If this were to be true, then the same would be the case with the vestige of All For One, which it isn't. If All Might were to die, he wouldn't magically complete his vestige and therefore be able to communicate with Deku directly through the power. The reason All Might's vestige isn't completely formed is because he was born quirkless. As expressed by All For One, within every quirk is the will of its original possessor. All Might is only partially formed because One For All, during its time with him, assimilated itself to his body and became his quirk, just as it has in the case of Deku currently. Now, with this information in mind, the next thing we need to comprehend is why the vestiges assume the forms that they do. The first possibility being that they assume the physical appearances they possessed when they initially received the quirk. After all, none of the former users were able to hold onto the power for too long before dying. But with All For One looking as mangled as he does, and the fourth possessing the scars of quirk overload, we may dismiss this possibility entirely. Next, there is the chance they assume the forms they possess at the point of transfer. This fits in a lot better, but even still, I'm not really convinced, as despite being only partially formed, the vestige of All Might is clearly a far cry from the visuals of All Might that we know and love. This is more like Toshinori when he was Shimura Nana's disciple. And so with that, the somewhat dissatisfying conclusion to be had is that it depends. Again, we are talking about the respective wills of these characters and their own individual identities. They simply assume the form they most know themselves to be. For your average person, that'll be who they were till the end. In the case of All For One, sure, he may have looked better in his youth, but this is someone who doesn't look back and struggle with regrets. The fact of the matter is that he has grown not only stronger, but smarter with time. So why opt to be less than? When it comes to All Might more than anything is a symbol. He is a brave and courageous persona that Toshinori Yagi had to invent for the sake of fulfilling his lofty dreams of peace. The visage of All Might is the symbol of peace, and frankly, that isn't very human. It's like the unrealistic expectations portrayed by a typical celebrity social media page. But with such a demanding task to be fulfilled, there was no time to be Toshinori the person, and so he pretty much just remained the same. And if you're wondering why he hasn't shifted to his current appearance, well, that's because All Might himself doesn't even identify with it. A degree of body dysphoria, if you will. And at this point, hopefully you are now beginning to recognize the importance of identity here. In a sense, Deku is only partially formed in the vestige world because he has yet to fully assimilate to the power of One For All. But there is also the mental recognition that he has yet to that limits him as well. When he spoke his truth and approached the situation with the same core values of heroism as All Might, he assumed the form of his younger self, the same little kid who always wanted to be a hero. And when he did this, the mist cleared and he was completely formed. Even if only for just a moment. And again, this stuff is not metaphorical. It is actually happening in this space. The quirks of One For All and All For One work in the same way when it comes to the vestige world. I mean, any quirk that directly interacts with and manipulates other quirks in this way does. Now, Shigaraki Tomura has always been a very confused entity, whether he knew it or not. Even before this whole fusion thing, his self-identity has been an absolute mess. The moniker of Shigaraki Tomura is one that All For One bestowed onto him. In the vestige world of All For One, Shigaraki was faced by the Shimura family. Firstly by Hama, and please remember that this is not the afterlife. For the most part, the vast majority of the sequence consisted of inflated memories that played out word for word. Now what's interesting is that when faced by Hama, Shigaraki responded. When faced by his mother, Tenko responded. Now mind you, there were certain aspects of Tenko's appearance here that favor the visage of Shigaraki, but there was a shift without question. However, when his father surfaced, we see him go in the opposite direction, a crossroads between Tenko and Shigaraki. And it wasn't until All For One appeared that he went back to being just Shigaraki Tomura. But as he approached All For One, there was resistance from his family as they attempted to hold him back. But once more, this is not the afterlife. Now granted, Shimura Nana making an appearance and even telling him to never forget may serve to dispute that for some because he never actually met her at this point, but I am more than willing to believe that this is in fact resistance on the behalf of the Tenko aspect, if even just the guilt of what he had done. The placement of their hands were the exact same as where Shigaraki Tomura had placed their severed hands on his body, a subconscious effort on the part of Tenko to always be with his family and never forget, despite actually forgetting as Shigaraki Tomura. The disturbance of which, such as when Bakugo knocked off the hand of his father, being enough to trigger that inner turmoil. And the riddance of those hands, both in the physical and vestige worlds, signified a further estrangement from Tenko and the dominance of Shigaraki. The placement of the charred hand of his father by Spinner being enough to momentarily quell the resistance of Shigaraki enough for All For One to take control of the body at the end of the war. A slight pullback from that overwhelming hatred and anger. The color of his hair also being a signifier of this distance. But unfortunately, the will to destroy, at least right now, greatly outweighs the will to be a hero. And so the Tenko aspect has mostly been suppressed. And I believe this will be the fatal flaw in All For One's plan. He will successfully bond with Shigaraki Tomura completely, but that does not mean that he will become one with Shimura Tenko, the boy who always wanted to be a hero. In fact, during his consideration of Star's quirk, the fusion also considered how her quirk would work on Tenko's childhood pet dog, a rather odd thing for either All For One or Shigaraki to consider. But in saving that boy, Deku will be able to do something that nobody else can, in the process embodying true heroics, and alongside him, at least in the vestige world, which will no doubt be thrown into chaos, Shimura Tenko will finally be a hero too. The way his mother's presence was able to push him so close to being Tenko is not without reason. Even in seeing the horrific things he had inadvertently done, and the danger he posed, she still ran forwards and reached out to her boy. And that is exactly what Deku is essentially planning on doing, despite having no familial link to him at all. In the comments, let us know what you think about this theory of ours. If you have been with the channel for a while, then you know that plot armor theories like these are no joke. And so when we do truly begin to approach the final events of the series, I hope you guys remember this one. And also remember to subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on, because when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.